My name is Katie Sullivan. I work in Catholic Campus Ministry, and I am the University Minister for Catholic Social Concerns. A large part of my job is spent with the 10 students who live in the Vincent Louise House every year, which is an intentional faith living community here on campus. These 3 individuals over here have all either lived in the house or are currently living in the house. And to start, I'd like to give them the opportunity to share a little bit about who they are and what drew them to living in the Vincent Louise House.
Hi everyone, my name is Bauer. I'm a senior and I currently live in the Vincent Louise House. I chose to live in the house because I really wanted to live with a community of my peers who are interested in some of the same things as I were. And although we all have different interests in social justice, I think just knowing that I'm surrounded by people who are just motivated was something that brought me here.
Hi, my name is Patrick. I'm a 3rd year and I'm studying writing, rhetoric, and discourse with a double minor in poli-sci and Catholic studies. What drew me to want to live in the house is that when I first came to DePaul, I kind of first got introduced to social justice, Catholic social teaching, Vincentianism, and those sort of ideas, and I realized that that was something that maybe I wanted to sort of commit my life to and in future career work towards, and I thought that the Vincent Louise House would be an excellent opportunity for me to kind of like take those for a test and see like, okay, I say I believe in these values, but can I live them out in a year in community? And I think that doing it in community was something that would have like really helped me learn. Just because I can say that I can do those by myself, but doing it with 9 other people is a really powerful experience, and I'm currently living in the house.
Hi, my name is Madeline Gemoules, and I am a senior studying chemistry. And I lived in the house last year, and I also currently work in Catholic Campus Ministry. Katie's actually my boss. And I was introduced to community living in high school. I went on a few service trips to different intentional Catholic communities, and actually spent a summer with a group of Catholic farmers, and loved the experience, and kind of wanted to put that into practice as soon as possible. And I was actually looking for colleges that had an intentional community year, and DePaul is one of them, and I just kind of fell in love. So.
Before we move on, can everyone hear all right, or do we need to use the microphones? How many of you here have heard of the Vincent Louise House before coming today? So not a lot of you. So our next part of this panel, we're going to have the students explain what the Vincent Louise House is. Just to start, I will tell you it is a program of Catholic Campus Ministry. 10 students apply to live in the house every year. You have to be an incoming sophomore, junior, or senior to live in the house. And I'm going to let the 3 of them tell you a little bit more about what the house does, some of the programs it offers throughout the year, and what some of the commitments they are asked to do throughout the year are.
So the house that we live in has 5 different core values or tenets. Thank you. So one of them is simple living, the other is community living, social justice, service, and faith. And so all of the requirements that we have to do during the year in some way relate to those things.
And so then some of the requirements that we have as kind of living out those tenets are we have to do 6 hours of community service a week, and that includes doing some at the St. Vincent de Paul Soup Kitchen right by the church on Webster. And then we also have community nights every Thursday night where all 10 of the students that are living in the house, we come together, and from 6 to 10 on Thursdays we kind of discuss living in community, how's it going for everyone, and do check-ins. And then we also do community dinners Sunday through Wednesday night, where at 6 o'clock, where we open our doors to the wider DePaul community. We cook a home-cooked meal. Anyone and everyone's welcome to come in, and we just want to feed people. So that's really cool. And then for the other tenets, when it comes to like social justice and simple living and faith, as a house, we kind of come together and decide like, how do we want to live out these tenets? What is our house going to look like? So that kind of puts it in our hands and puts us in control in figuring out how are we going to live out these tenets, and kind of gives us the opportunity to make each house experience unique each year.
And then just one other requirement, in the spring, we all go on a service immersion trip, kind of like in union. It's our own personal one. And in the past, we've gone to DC. These guys went to Macon, Georgia, but it's mostly centered around poverty and homelessness in a different light.
So today's session is on living Catholic social teaching in daily practice. So in front of you, you should have all gotten an orange sheet that has the 7 tenets of Catholic social teaching as described by the U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops. What I have are some questions for the panelists. They will take turns answering. Sometimes maybe 1 or 2 of them will answer. Occasionally, maybe all 3 of them will answer. At the end, we will have time if you have any questions. So if something comes up that you want to ask, just remember it for the end of our conversation. So I'd just like to start, panelists, and ask, before living in the V&L house, how knowledgeable were you about Catholic social teaching?
For me, before I came into the house, I was fairly knowledgeable on it because my knowledge of Catholic social teaching is one of the things that drew me to the house because I thought it would be a way to live that out. But prior to coming to DePaul, I had little knowledge of it, but just through getting involved in organizations like Catholic for Social Concerns and just other service groups at DePaul, that was sort of my introduction to Catholic social teaching. And then since living it and really being conscious of it while living in the house, it has given me an even deeper and more appreciative understanding of it.
For me, I had only heard of it and had been briefly told about it. I went to an event that Catholic Campus Ministry was hosting during Lent, and I think it was about conflict in Syria. I think this was last year, maybe the year before that. But there was somebody there from Catholic Relief Services whose job was to talk to students and help them out about this. And so I had heard of it from her, but that was about it. I didn't know much else. I think I did learn a lot more because I've been in the house.
One of the themes of Catholic social teaching is the call to family, community, and participation. How have you noticed this theme playing out as a member of the Vincent Louise House? Have you noticed any particular struggles in remaining committed to community and active participation?
I think it's just pretty easy to live in a house, right? If you've all lived in dorm rooms before with roommates, maybe it's not so easy, right, if you have roommate conflicts, but I think it's really just to exist with 9 other people, but living in community is so much different, and it really calls you to be intentional with one another, to call them out when they're not doing their part or when something's wrong. And I think that's what community night is, or it was for me, and I don't know about you guys, but it's just a chance to talk and reflect and work out the hard things, because there are conflicts, and the longer you let it sit, the easier it is to just build up. And so it's a struggle. Living in community, it's not having 9 best friends. It's learning how to coexist with people who don't have the same faith background as you. The house is rooted in Catholic social teaching, but you don't have to be Catholic to live there. I'm just open to the teachings. So it's a very interesting experience.
Yeah, I definitely, with the whole, you're not living with 9 of your best friends, I'm kind of learning to differentiate between liking someone and loving them, and how, living in an intentional community, or at least for me, I'm committing myself to being in a relationship with my 9 other housemates, to actively learn about their lives and talk with them, and not just kind of hey, and then when I ask, how was your day, really wanting to hear that answer on how was their day, and processing it with them, rather than just oh, good, and going off. It's sort of that heightened, working through those conflicts, and if they say, I want to do this, then holding them accountable and really committing yourself to that in a way that, at least until I lived in the house, I hadn't really experienced before. Because I lived in the dorms and lived in an apartment, and I was kind of friends with the people I was living with, but we never really were committed to building a relationship of the type that was that intentionality.
I would definitely agree with a lot of what's been said. I think a lot of applicants to the house think that they're going to live in a house with 9 best friends and everything's going to be great and wonderful and you guys will have sleepovers and I don't know, there's, I think, that misconception. And it definitely turns out to be a lot harder than that, but definitely worth it. It's a lot of hard work and can be very challenging at times when you realize that some people have very different opinions than you or don't care about the same things, and learn to respect those differences and to try to support someone, even if you might not be always in agreement with some of their opinions, has been a challenge and a real struggle. But I think the idea of intentional community is that you're going to try, and you're going to try to be intentional about it. And like what Pat said about asking somebody how their day was and really meaning it, it's a huge difference, I think, from when I'm walking down the street and I know somebody who I see and they say like, oh, how's it going? And then you guys just pass each other without really talking about it. So even if there are some people in the house that you don't connect with, it's really nice to know that they still really do care.
Moving on to the dignity of the human person. Has there been a moment from your B&L experience when you felt particularly connected to the idea that everyone has dignity, and the dignity of the human person is prevalent in all those people around you and all that you're doing?
A moment that stands out to me actually recently occurred. Me and Pat just got back from our service trip to Macon, Georgia, and we were at a soup kitchen this one day, and we weren't serving there. We were just sitting down with people and having a meal. And one of the men who was somebody obviously in charge, he was standing in the front of the line right before people would get their food and shaking every single person's hand, well over 100 people, and saying, thank you for coming, welcome, we're really glad to have you. And he seemed very, very genuine, and often he really did know the people that he was saying hi to from the years of them coming there, and from his genuine care to get to know them and asking them like, oh, how's this job you applied for? How's this working for you? Or how's, your health? And I think that personability was really, I don't know, it struck me because sometimes you don't really see that. And I've volunteered a lot of different places that are doing really great things, but sometimes forget to really know the person. So just reinforcing someone's human dignity by getting to know them and shaking their hand made a huge difference.
For me, definitely the trip to Macon, as Julie mentioned, was also really impactful. And for me, my service in Chicago, I volunteer in Back of the Yards, which is on the south side, with, at this organization called Precious Blood Ministries, where they work with formerly incarcerated or at risk of being incarcerated youth. And through my experience there, I think it's really been impactful for me that on that idea that every person has value, every person has dignity, and you can't just like pigeonhole someone into one thing. Because a lot of these youth that I'm working with have been to juvie, have done some not very good things, but that alone, it doesn't define them as people. Like in just my conversations with them, I learned they have hopes, they have dreams, they recognize like they don't like the situation that they're in, but it just kind of repeats itself, and there are things that are holding them down. And I think that recognition that you can't just define them by this one action that they did, and they have dignity and they deserve better, and they also have like those things that make us all people and that make us all human, essentially, and that we all have dignity.
When I was thinking about this question, I first thought of a negative experience that I had, and it was last year. While I was working at the soup kitchen, I had a bad encounter with one of our patrons, and I think in those moments it's so hard to find the dignity in that person. But one of my favorite things to talk about, and I'm not very knowledgeable about it, but incarnational theology is so beautiful. Trying to see Jesus Christ in every person and understanding that they have that in them as you do. And so searching for it can be so difficult, but kind of like Patrick said, it's important to understand that these people may not be having a good day, or are pigeonholed into something that they've been told for their entire lives. So I think finding human dignity in everybody is really hard. I'm sure you've known as you've had difficult experiences with people you've come into contact with, but yeah, I think that it's important to think about. It makes day-to-day interactions more intentional, and I think easier.
The panelists have spoken a bit about their commitment to service while members of the V&L House, and our next question has to do with that. How have your service experiences helped you to better understand the preferential option for the poor, or the option also known as the option for the poor and vulnerable?
think there's a lot of that recognition. I think mostly that kind of like we were talking about, like every person has dignity and kind of recognizing that every person is a person. I think at least prior to coming to Chicago, it was kind of easy to create this other person when it comes to the poor and the vulnerable. Like they're not like me, you know, they're lazy or they don't work hard or they're addicted to drugs or alcohol or something like that, and make them, they're not like me at all. And I think through my experiences in the house and just having encountered people that are going through really rough situations, but then recognizing the humanness of them, and then recognizing that a lot of what they're going through is out of their hands and can deal a lot with sort of the systems that are in place, and then recognizing that a way to kind of counteract that would be to create this preferential option for the poor, to create policies and create ideas with their best interest first and foremost. So then when creating policies, we first ask, how will this affect the poorest of the poor? How will this affect the most vulnerable in our society? And I think through my experiences in the house, I've realized how there's a lot working against the poor and the marginalized of our society, and that just even asking that question can go a long way, and then just being in sort of solidarity with them and accompanying them through that process, and not necessarily thinking of ourselves as like, I'm up here, they're down here, and I'm this great person that's helping them up, but rather we both are human, and we both are kind of at that same level in creating that option, and then also empowering them to help themselves, I think also is part of that option, and then recognizing how there's dignity in that too, and having that power and that control. I know we do tutoring at my volunteering site at Precious Blood, and for that a lot of the students don't always bring homework for us, but we still are there and we still give them options. And one of the students that we worked with, he came up to one of us and said, hey, he gave us the book How Long Will I Cry, which was published by DePaul. That was a collection of testimonials about youth violence in Chicago, and he actually came up to the volunteers and was like, I want to discuss this with you all, and I want to read this with you. And sort of that was really awesome, because they were taking that in their own hands, and we kind of created that option, the preferential option for them, that we were there for them, but ultimately it was up for them to sort of take it on themselves and empower themselves to further their education.
At my service site, which is Little Sisters of the Poor, it's an elderly home right off campus. I know that they have a preferential option for the poor in the way that they admit people, residents, to live in the home. And I know they have a really long waiting list, and there's a lot of people who like to live in a home where they have a nutritionalist specialist and they have nurses on staff 24/7, and it's just a really nice home. And so I'm sure a lot of people want to live there, but they only take in people who have money underneath this certain threshold. So I think in some ways it can be sort of controversial, because if one person who has maybe $1,000 more than somebody else might not get into the home as the poor person would. But after doing my service there and talking to the people and hearing about some of the situations that they were facing, it was like a failing health situation, or maybe their house was foreclosing, and learning that they didn't really have all that many options. Some of them are just really heartbreaking. I think I had never considered, like, what's going to happen when my parents get older, what's going to happen when I get older, but having been in that environment all year and meeting people who have family in Chicago, but those families are either choose not to take care of their older relatives or are unable to, or hearing about residents who live there who don't have family in the state at all, or don't have family or friends who could have taken care of them, makes me really appreciate this preferential option for poor being like one of the values of Catholic social teaching. Just knowing, like, sometimes that those people do have a lot less options.
I think the way that I see the preferential option for the poor, well, I see it often, but I started working with the Chicago Coalition for the Homeless last year, and I'm doing it again this year. And one thing that stood out to me was that yesterday we went to Springfield to lobby for next year's budget for the state of Illinois, preserving the human services budget, specifically homeless funding. And I guess you could think about it as, you know, a bunch of of college students getting together with the coalition to go and to lobby this, but I would say over half of the people with us, it was like half college students, and then half people who were either experiencing homelessness or had been before, and there was a big population, or a few students who were students at universities but were experiencing homelessness at this current time, either kind of couch surfing or don't have like a permanent residence. And so thinking about kind of what Patrick said, where it's important that these people are able to have a voice themselves, it was just really moving to see them go and bug legislators and tell them their story and say, hey, this is important and this is how many people it affects and I'm one of those people, was really moving, and I felt like it was something that was just so bigger than myself. So that's kind of how I see it and how it's important to me.
Patrick used the term solidarity. Solidarity is another theme of Catholic social teaching, and it's one that can often be difficult to articulate. The U.S. Catholic Conference of Bishops uses terms such as "we are our brothers, sisters, and keepers," and stresses that we are one human family when they're describing what solidarity is. What do you three think solidarity means as a member of the V&L House, as a DePaul student, as a Chicago resident, or as a citizen of the world?
I think, and like Katie said, solidarity is still something that I'm also still discerning about what exactly that means to me and coming up with different definitions and figuring that out. But I think solidarity kind of just goes to just either just as a person or even as a resident of Chicago or really anyone. I think it just means recognizing the humanity of people and just recognizing sort of the power that is in that, and not necessarily creating like these barriers between you and others. When we were in Macon, Georgia for our service trip this last spring, we went to this place called Daybreak that essentially was this community center for, Macon has a very large homeless population, so it was essentially a community center for those individuals. And it was a place where they could they could go and get services, they could have their laundry done, they could take showers, they could use computers, but they also could just hang out. And the whole room, the facility looked like this giant lounge, really. And they could just go, hang out, play checkers, play chess, that was huge, and just kind of talk. And I think for me, when we went there, some of us did do actual volunteering, like helping with laundry, or I taught some people how to use a computer, but other times we just hung out and we just talked. And I think for me, that was a really powerful moment of solidarity because there wasn't this divide between us. I mean, I remember when I was there, this woman named Vanessa just kind of like pulled me over and was like, hey, are you one of the students from DePaul? And I said, sure, and I said yes. And then she's like, oh, how's it going? And we just kind of talked, and she ended up telling me a lot about her life experiences and what she's been through, and I shared some of mine. And there wasn't sort of this divide between us. It was just we were two people occupying the space and sharing with each other and building a relationship. And I think for me, that was a really powerful moment of being in solidarity and just kind of recognizing the humanness of her, and then also recognizing that there are probably lots of other people that I encounter in my service that have had similar experiences as her, and then recognizing sort of the humanness of them too. And it can be easy to make, kind of like I was talking about earlier, like make the homeless just kind of like this faceless statistic or just numbers. But I think for me what solidarity means is recognizing the humanness of every single one of those people. And it doesn't have to just be homelessness. It can be people that are experiencing war, people that are experiencing poverty, or experiencing discrimination of some type. I think just solidarity for me means recognizing the humanness of each of those individuals. And while I will never have a relationship or meet all of them, or even like a small, minute amount of them, just recognizing that they are all people and they all have that dignity and they all deserve something better.
I think that solidarity for me is kind of bridges the gap between what is sympathy and what is empathy. I think that obviously you can feel bad for somebody, especially when Like Patrick said, they're faceless and they're just kind of over there and they're the poor. But I think empathy comes in when you really sit down with a person, and I don't think you can ever really know their whole story, but try to understand, try to feel some of what they're feeling. That's when I think that you create the humanness between you and that person, and make that connection that makes it not sympathy but empathy, and a true like desire to want to know about them, and a true care for them too.
For me, solidarity is still something that I really struggle with, trying to think how I, as someone who's visibly white and has a great education and have parents and family who can support me and have all these privileges, like how do I relate to somebody who might live on the other side of the world in the slums of India, for example. So it's like, how do I relate to that person? And I think it goes back to like the inherent dignity of each person. Like we relate on a very human level. And solidarity really challenges me to think about my privileges and think about how I can be there for people who I might not even know. So I think that's one of the reasons why living in community is so great, because I think that if I was to be spending all of my money on clothes or leaving all the lights on, my housemates would call me out on that, and they would say like, what are you doing? How are those choices affecting other people who you might not see or ever know? They would, I think, call me out on that kind of thing and ask me those challenging questions. I think everybody should be able to ask themselves those questions, but there's a lot of things that you overlook. So it's really great to have people around who do hold you accountable.
We have about 10 minutes left, and I'd like to open it up if you all have any questions for the group. I can ask more questions as well, but I'd like to give you all the opportunity to ask anything that might have come to mind. So there's a microphone right in center. If you want to ask a question, if you could just go ahead and go up to the microphone and use that.
It's right in front of me. I'll ask a question. Thank you all for sharing your perspectives. I guess your comments have been so insightful. I just wonder, your experience living in the BNL house, how's that helped in your own personal spiritual growth and development?
Well, I know for me, it's helped in ways I could never have imagined. Because I think one of the ways that I experienced God, because I am very much also like fascinated with incarnational theology, and just sort of like whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me, and that you can experience Christ and experience God through others. And I think as I've come to DePaul and really sort of delved into my own spirituality and reconnected with Catholicism, I've realized how much people give me life and give me energy, and how that's how I can experience God a lot, both by experiencing through service, but also just in everyday life. And I think living with 9 other people that are also intentionally, for me, has fed my spirituality a lot, and it's made me feel much closer to God this year than I have probably ever in my life up to this point. So that's helpful. Also, we take, as part of the house, we take a class together where we talk a lot, where we literally dive into Catholic theology and different ways of experiencing God, and that gave me a lot more of sort of the theology behind it. And even though a lot of those views I kind of already knew I agreed with, now I have much better language to articulate exactly how I'm feeling, and other resources to go to if I'm struggling with my spirituality and I'm struggling to make sense of something. I have not only like the academic resources, but also 9 other housemates that I can go to and ask about that.
Hello, I'm very impressed that you guys all do 6 hours of community service a week. It's really cool. I am Catholic too, and for a while I was volunteering a lot, but recently, spiritually, I haven't felt the imperative. Now I do on occasion lose that sense of necessity. And what benefits spiritually do you get from doing community service, and I guess in a wider sense, do you think that kind of spirituality is the highest form of, or do you think it's a necessity? Like, and I'm sure you guys all pray, but that's my question. Not a break.
I think for me, this year, especially this winter quarter, getting out of my homework zone and leaving the house and walking down the street to go do service, something that is like a 5-minute walk and should be really easy to do, has been a real struggle. I know that sometimes my service isn't the most fun place to be. Sometimes I hear a lot of sad stories and it bums me out, and it's not something that I really am looking forward to go do. And I think that's where having a community of people who encourage you to go and who hold you accountable comes in handy. And not everybody has that, but it's been a huge blessing for me to know that if I wasn't going to service, I could talk about why that is, or why it's really difficult for me. And I have people there to encourage me and to talk that out. And so that's been huge, just having a community there. And I think spiritually, going to service is always where I've found God, to phrase it that way. I think that I really kept grounded in my service. Like when I go, it really does help me think about things that I take for granted and things that I need to appreciate more and to thank God for more. I know that I've gone to service sometimes and called my parents afterwards and said, thank you so much for letting me go to a really nice high school and paying those really high, taxes so that I could live in that area. I definitely didn't think about those things in high school. Or I feel like my freshman year of college, I didn't think about those things, but as I've been doing more and more service, I've thought a lot more about things that otherwise I wouldn't have. So even though it can be really challenging, I think that I do get a lot out of it, spiritually and other ways too.
Yeah, I think service does help me spiritually a lot, just kind of in rooting myself in sort of experiencing Christ with the other, and a lot of whatever you do for the least of these, you do for me, and just knowing that I'm experiencing God through those. And it can be tough sometimes, and I don't feel it all the time, but I think just being able to root myself in that and know okay, Patrick, you didn't feel it this time, but you will probably next time. And sort of the idea of, there's this, in liberation theology, there's this idea of praxis, where it's essentially you live out your faith, and you go forth, and you actually, it manifests itself in action. And I think that is a balance that I have gotten a lot better at since living in Vincent Louise House, where I still have the contemplative, prayer and just kind of reflection, but then also that then pushes me to want to move to action and to do service. And obviously, I'm not going to. I think it'd be great if everyone did community service, but I don't think that that's. I'm not going to say whether or not that's a necessity for everyone, but I know for me personally, I feel as if it is a necessity, and kind of in terms of Catholic social teaching, the rights and responsibilities, I feel like as a Catholic, I personally feel called to do this, and I feel that it's necessary in order for me to honor the dignity of a person and recognize that they were made in God's image and that God created every person with that dignity. So for me, it does feel like it's a responsibility, but obviously, I would like to say that'd be universal for everyone, but obviously I'm not going to force everyone to do service.
I think the bottom line here is that if you're going to do this sort of service, anybody in the audience, you need support to do it in your community. What you're living, what I see is kind of monastic in that sense, because you're doing service and you're supporting each other. It's just the lay person, like the lady instead of the monks. If you want to comment, it's just a comment. I don't have a question. I admire what you're doing. It's very deliberate, and it's. I don't know if you're going to do it the rest of your lives, but it will certainly be before whatever career you choose.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And this will be our last question.
So the name of the session that your panel was part of is Spiritual Toolkit. And the idea was that there's a lot of people that they want to pray, they want to feel this desire to connect with God, but they just kind of don't know how. And so, what's your advice? What have you found works? How do you pray? How do you connect?
Patrick said, I definitely connect through others. I see, like informational theology, I see beautiful things come from beautiful people, and it just, I feel that closeness to God, and one of those things is, one of our requirements is to go to Sunday night Mass as a group, and that's probably one of my favorite times. It's a time to be in the intentional presence of God, but then also to be with my 9 other housemates. And that time just to sit there and to pray together and to embrace each other during the sign of peace is just something so beautiful. And I think that's where my kind of my spirituality lies, in the way that I really feel God's presence. And even this year, a lot of my housemates still go to Mass, and we still sit together, and it's definitely a beautiful continuation.
Yeah, I think it's definitely exactly what Madeline said, just experiencing people and finding relationships that give me joy, and then recognizing sort of that joy and that it's almost indescribable, that feeling of that is God, and that the joy that comes from that, having a real connection with someone and just experiencing that relationship is something that is really beautiful, and that's where I experience God. I also experience God a lot through music. That's just something that speaks to my soul a lot and makes me feel alive and makes me feel joy. And so I know when I'm having these moments where either I had a really heavy day at service, or I'm kind of questioning if this is really what I want to be doing, or I'm just struggling, going back to those touchstones, I think, are really important, because that's what, one, it reconnects me with God, but then also it keeps me going in this commitment to Catholic social teaching and social justice that I have, because I think those are necessary to have in order to really stay in it for the long haul.
Someone once described to me that being in a relationship with God is being like being in a relationship with anybody else, in the sense that it has those ups and downs. And I think that I was under the impression that after I became a Christian, that I would always be feeling God and feeling it all the time, and that was not the case, as it turns out. And I think during those lulls, during those challenging times where I'm not feeling it, I really have to challenge myself to take a lot of appreciation in those little things. When some of my housemates are just hanging out in the kitchen and talking, or someone's making me food, or someone stops by my room and says hey, how's it going? It's really those little moments that make me think no, people are really good, and it just makes me feel good, and really reflecting on those good moments. They seem really small, but I think they really do add up to a lot. So if anyone's kind of not feeling God, or being really challenged to go to service or go to church or to do things that you normally do to feel it, I would say just kind of reflect on those small moments. I think that there's a lot of beauty in them, and that I think in other people and in relationships with people, that's where you find God, and sometimes those are the smaller things.
Thank you, Patrick, Madeline, and Julie. For those of you who are interested, they did mention Sunday through Wednesday, the Vincent Louise House does offer dinner for anyone in the DePaul community, and those dinners are at 6 p.m. and the house is at 2308 North Sheffield. So if you heard something tonight and you're oh, I really want to learn more, there will always be at least 2 current residents of the house at the dinner as they serve dinner. So thank you very much for being here, and thank you again to our panelists.